It is known by many names: Dune, the desert planet, Arrakis. For millennia, it has been the fulcrum of galactic power, the sole source of the most valuable substance in the known universe. But the history of Arrakis as a political and economic prize is but a recent footnote in a planetary saga spanning billions of years. To truly understand this world, one must look beyond the chronicles of humanity and into the deep time of geology and ecology. This is the story of Arrakis before the Spice Wars, before the Fremen, before it was ever named, the untold history of how a world of fire and water became the desert that would shape an empire. The accepted histories, the grand chronicles of great houses, and Padishah emperors are merely the latest layer of dust on a geologic tome of immense thickness. Standard ecological models present desertification as an ending, a process of degradation where life is scoured away. On Arrakis, however, the desert was a beginning. Buried deep beneath the dunes, deeper than any sandworm could burrow, lies the evidence of a different world entirely. A world of fire, of vast oceans, and of slow, inexorable continental change. To understand Arrakis, it must first be unlearned. Its history must be traced back to its violent birth. The key to this world is not found in its present, but in its past. The air, cool and sharp, carries the faint, mineral scent of crushed rock, an immense distance. The dominant sound is the whisper of wind sculpting a dune, a billion grains of sand finding a new place of rest. But beneath the surface, there is a deep and patient vibration that is not a threat, but a planetary heartbeat. This is the chronicle of that planet, a journey back to the very beginning, when there was only fire and stone and the patient unfolding of time itself. Chapter 01, The Planet Beneath the Names. The story of Arrakis begins not with people, but with physics. Before it was a destination, it was a mote of dust. Before it was a resource, it was a convergence of matter and gravity. Before it was called Arrakis, it had no name, for there were no minds to give it one. Any serious study must begin there, in that profound and silent anonymity, peeling back the layers of language, history, and biology to seek the planet itself. The raw sphere of matter that existed long before it held any meaning for humankind. To comprehend this world, the human sense of scale must be abandoned. The reigns of emperors, the rise and fall of great houses, the entire span of recorded human history, these are but the blink of an eye to a planet. This story is not measured in years or even centuries, but in epochs. The protagonist is not a person, but geology itself. The slow, inexorable forces of planetary formation, of atmospheric change, of a world finding its equilibrium over billions of revolutions around its star. This is the true foundation of all that would later come to pass. The spice, the worms, the Fremen are all consequences. Endnotes to a story that began in cosmic fire. In a swirling disk of incandescent gas and dust around the young, energetic star Canopus, gravity, the patient sculptor, began its work. Particles clung to other particles. Pebbles became boulders. Boulders became planetesimals. And these nascent worlds collided in a violent, creative dance that spanned millions of years. Arrakis was born from this celestial forge, a sphere of molten rock and heavy metals, glowing with the internal heat of its own creation. It was not a desert then. It was a furnace. A liquid world of magma under a sky thick with volcanic gases and the dust of constant impacts. This first chapter of the planet's history is written in lava and basalt. There is no life, no water, no sand. There is only the slow, rhythmic pulse of a planet's heart, a core of iron and nickel settling into its center, generating the magnetic field that would one day shield its surface. The surface itself was a sea of fire, constantly churned by asteroid and comet strikes, each impact delivering new materials, new energy, new possibilities. This was an age of chaos, but it was a purposeful chaos. From this violence, a stable world was being forged. The names given to planetary features, desert, ocean, mountain, are merely snapshots of a process. They capture a single moment in a world's long, flowing life. The desert of Arrakis is simply its current state, its present chapter. To see it as only a vast and barren wasteland is to read the last page of a book and assume knowledge of the entire story. The truth, buried beneath kilometers of sand, is that Arrakis has been many things. It has worn many faces. The journey from a world of fire to a world of sand is the great, untold epic of its existence. The endless, shifting seas of sand that define the planet seem eternal, immovable in their sheer scale. But they are a geologically recent development, a thin blanket laid over a much older, harder truth. The wind that shapes those dunes is a latecomer. The sun that bakes them is the same sun that once shone on a very different landscape. A scientific mindset must be trained to see through the sand, to perceive the bedrock beneath, to read the story in the composition of the planet's very crust. The history of Arrakis is not a history of conquest, but of transformation. It is a case study in how planetary systems function, how life adapts, and how destiny can be written in the language of chemistry and physics long before any thinking creature arrives to read it. The desert is not an absence of life. It is a different kind of life, a system with its own rules, its own logic, its own inexorable momentum. And that system was born in this ancient past, in the slow cooling of the magma seas and the first condensation of a strange, primordial atmosphere. In this quiet, prebiotic space, the seeds of everything that was to come can be found. The potential for the spice was there in the unique mineral composition of the planet's mantle. The potential for the great worms was there in the way the world's crust cooled and fractured. The potential for a desert planet was there in its orbit, its axial tilt, and the composition of its first atmosphere. Arrakis was not an accident. It was a consequence. This is the forging of that consequence. It is a process driven by the slow, patient pulse of geological time, a rhythm so deep it makes the frantic pace of human life seem insignificant. This is not just a visit to a planet. It is an examination of an age, a deep and silent era when the world was making itself. From this foundation of fire and stone, the next stage of the planet's evolution would begin. The long cooling was not just an ending for one era, but the necessary precondition for the next. Chapter 02: Fire, Stone, and the Long Cooling. In its primordial state, past all recorded time, Arrakis was unrecognizable. It was a furnace world. It hung in the void not as a cinnamon-dusted orb, but as a bruised, glowing ember. Its surface was a shifting, incandescent ocean of magma, kilometers deep. The sky above was not blue or black, but a suffocating, ruddy blanket of carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and superheated vapor, lit from below by the planet's own internal fire. This was the Hadean age of Arrakis, an era of unimaginable violence and sublime creation. For millions of years, this was the planet's state of being. A relentless rain of cosmic debris, the leftovers from the solar system's formation, pummeled the molten surface. Each impact from city-sized asteroids to mountains of ice sent up great, splashing crowns of liquid rock that cooled and fell back into the glowing sea. These collisions were not just destructive, they were additive. They delivered volatile elements, water, ice, and organic molecules, seeding the young world with the raw ingredients for its future. Every crater, every shockwave was a formative event, stirring the planetary crucible and shaping the world's ultimate composition. Beneath this hellish surface, a great sorting was underway. The heaviest elements, primarily iron and nickel, sank through the liquid mantle under the relentless pull of gravity. They journeyed toward the planet's center, coalescing into a dense, superheated core. As this metallic heart formed, its motion generated a powerful magnetic field, a dynamo that pushed out into space. This magnetosphere became the planet's first shield, an invisible guardian that began to deflect the most harmful solar winds and cosmic radiation. Without this shield, any atmosphere the planet might form would be stripped away into space. The formation of the core was the first promise of a stable future, a quiet, unseen event of monumental importance. Slowly, patiently, over spans of time that dwarf human comprehension, the planet began to radiate its primordial heat into the cold vacuum of space. The relentless bombardment from above lessened as the surrounding space was swept clean of debris. The surface of the magma ocean began to cool, starting at the poles, the regions receiving the least direct energy from the young star Canopus. Here, the first solid land began to form, Dark, glassy flakes of basalt and obsidian appeared on the surface of the glowing sea, like the first film of ice on a still pond. At first, they were temporary, fragile rafts of rock that were quickly consumed by upwelling currents of hotter magma from below. They cracked, foundered, and were swallowed back into the liquid depths. But with each passing millennium, they became more numerous, larger, and more resilient. They collided and merged, forming the first microcontinent's dark islands of stability in a sea of fire. These early landmasses were not the continents of later ages. They were jagged, volcanic, and utterly barren. Great shield volcanoes, fed by plumes of molten rock from the deep mantle, rose from their surfaces. They spewed forth vast quantities of gas and lava, thickening the atmosphere and expanding the crust. Rivers of black ropey Paho lava flowed across the dark plains, cooling into immense basaltic fields. These are the foundation stones of Arrakis, the bedrock that now lies hidden beneath the endless sand. The cooling was not a smooth, linear process. It was a cycle of advance and retreat. A large impact could shatter a nascent continent, resetting the clock for that region. A surge of volcanic activity could resurface hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. But the overall trend was toward equilibrium. The planet was exhaling its birth heat. The crust thickened, becoming a more permanent feature. The gaps between the proto-continents shrank as the magma seas slowly solidified into the first ocean floors of rock, not water. As the surface temperature dropped below the boiling point of certain compounds, the atmosphere began to change. Thick, noxious clouds of sulfuric acid and other volatiles condensed, falling as a corrosive rain that sizzled on the hot rock. This was not a life-giving rain, but a chemical scouring. It reacted with the fresh basalt, altering its composition, weathering the first mountains, and carving the first riverbeds channels that would flow with chemicals, not water. It was in this chemical soup, in the interaction between the outgassing mantle, the reactive crust, and the energy from the star, that the unique mineral signature of Arrakis became locked into place. The planet's geology is subtly different from other terrestrial worlds. A unique concentration of certain elements, a quirk of its formation, led to the specific silicates and mineral deposits that would, eons later, become crucial to the spice cycle. The destiny of Dune was being written in this stone, in this fire. This entire age, the long cooling, may have lasted for 500 million years or more. It was an immense, silent, and lonely period. The only sounds were the hiss of chemical rain, the rumble of volcanoes, and the deep, groaning stress of a cooling crust. The colors were stark: the black of fresh basalt, the angry red of lava flows, and the ochre and sulfur yellow of mineral deposits against a perpetually overcast, ruddy sky. There was no life. The conditions were far too extreme. But the stage was being meticulously set. The planet was stabilizing. The core was generating its protective shield. The crust was forming, locking away certain chemicals and exposing others. The atmosphere was slowly evolving, a thick blanket that trapped heat and provided pressure. Arrakis was becoming a mature geological body, a solid world with a tangible landscape. The age of fire was ending, and the age of stone was truly beginning. This process of planetary cooling is a universal story, but on each world it has a unique accent. The specific gravity of Arrakis, its distance from Canopus, and its initial inventory of elements all guided it down a particular path, a path that led, inexorably, not to a lush, water-rich world, but to something else entirely, something drier, something stranger. As this fiery epoch ended, a world transformed emerged. The glowing magma seas had given way to vast, dark plains of basalt. Towering shield volcanoes stood silent against a thick, cloudy sky. The planet was still hot, sterile, and unwelcoming, but it was solid. It had a geography, and locked within its crust and atmosphere was the next critical ingredient for its future, an element delivered by icy comets during the bombardment: water. The memory of that water, and what became of it, forms the next chapter in the planet's story. The fire had cooled to stone, and now that stone awaited the first touch of rain. Chapter 03: The Memory of Water. As the surface of the young Arrakis cooled, a critical threshold was crossed. The planet was still hot by terrestrial standards. but it was no longer incandescent. It was now cool enough for the most abundant molecule delivered by cometary impacts to exist in its liquid state, water. The superheated steam and vapor that had saturated the thick, primordial atmosphere for millions of years began to condense. The first true rain to ever fall on Arrakis was not a gentle shower, but a deluge of biblical proportions, lasting for thousands of years. The thick orange clouds, laden with moisture, broke. Hot, acidic rain fell upon the black basaltic plains. It hissed and steamed, carving channels in the virgin rock and pooling in the vast, shallow basins left by the most ancient and colossal impacts. For the first time, the planet had a sound beyond the roar of volcanoes, the endless percussive drumming of rainfall. Slowly, over centuries of this unceasing downpour, the great basins began to fill. Shallow seas formed, then deepened into primordial oceans. These were not the clear, blue oceans of a tranquil world. They were hot, murky, and choked with dissolved minerals scoured from the fresh volcanic rock. They were acidic, almost oily, a chemical soup under a sky still thick with carbon dioxide and sulfur. But they were oceans nonetheless. For a time, Arrakis was a water world. This is a truth so contrary to the Arrakis of recorded history that it feels like a myth. Yet, the evidence remains, etched into the planet's deepest geology for those who know how to read it. Long, winding escarpments that stretch for hundreds of kilometers are, in fact, the fossilized shorelines of these ancient seas, polished smooth not by sand, but by the relentless action of waves. The vast salt flats, like the Pan, are the desiccated seabeds, the final resting place of evaporated oceans, their mineral wealth a testament to the water that once was. Deep in the rock strata, geologists have found sedimentary layers, sandstone, shale, that could only have been formed by the slow deposition of particles in a standing body of water. And perhaps most poignantly, mineral veins of gypsum and calcite, which only form in the presence of liquid water, trace the paths of ancient groundwater systems deep within the planet's crust. Based on these geological clues, a model of this aquatic age can be constructed. The sun, Canopus, was younger and slightly dimmer than in later eras, so its light would have struggled to penetrate the thick, cloudy atmosphere. The days would have been murky and dim, the surface of the hot oceans perpetually stirred by powerful winds and thermal currents. The tides, driven by the planet's moons if it had them, then would have been immense, washing over the low-lying volcanic shores. Could life have begun here? This is a profound and speculative question. The ingredients were present: liquid water, a rich supply of minerals, organic molecules delivered by comets, and energy sources from volcanic vents on the seafloor and lightning in the thick atmosphere. It is plausible that simple single-celled life could have emerged in these primordial oceans, not complex creatures, but extremophilic bacteria, thriving in the chemical-rich, superheated water around hydrothermal vents, metabolizing sulfur and other minerals. If such life existed, it left no obvious fossils. The immense geological pressures and the scouring of the later desert age would have erased almost all traces. Yet it remains a possibility that haunts the deep history of the planet, a quiet microbial biosphere, existing for hundreds of millions of years in the murky depths, playing its own small role in altering the planet's chemistry, subtly shifting the composition of the atmosphere by consuming some gases and releasing others. The planet may have been alive in the most fundamental way, long before the coming of the sand. The landscape of this water world Arrakis would have been stark and beautiful. Jet-black volcanic islands rising from a steaming olive-green sea. The air, thick and humid, would carry the sharp tang of sulfur and salt. There were no plants to soften the edges of the land, no soil, only bare rock, eroded and shaped by water and wind. The planet's color palette would have been one of dark grays, blacks, deep greens, and the rust red of oxidized iron leaching from the rock. For a vast span of time, this equilibrium held. A hot, wet world, with active volcanism and a dynamic, if simple, aquatic ecosystem. Rain would fall, rivers of acidic water would carve canyons into the highlands, and oceans would churn with chemical activity. The planet was in its second act, a stark contrast to its fiery birth. It was a world of water, a potential cradle of life, following a path that many other worlds in the galaxy have taken. But the destiny of Arrakis was different. The path it was on was not toward a stable, temperate climate. Forces were at work, both internal and external, that would slowly, inexorably, push the planet in another direction. The very processes that made the water world possible also contained the seeds of its destruction. The planet's atmosphere, its volcanic activity, and its relationship with its star were conspiring to begin the next great transformation. The memory of water would become just that, a memory, locked away in the rocks. The Great Drying was not a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping process that unfolded over eons. It was a thief that stole the oceans one drop at a time, a change so gradual that, had there been eyes to see it, it might have been imperceptible from one generation to the next. The shorelines began a slow, multi-millennial retreat. The shallow seas became vast salt marshes, and then cracked, dry pans. The epic age of water was coming to an end. This lost aquatic past is the ghost that haunts the desert planet, the secret history that explains so much of what is to come. The salt flats, the deep canyons, the very air itself, all are shaped by this era. The water is gone, but its memory is everywhere. Having seen the world awash in its oceans, we must now bear witness to their slow and mysterious disappearance, a planetary event that would set the stage for the rise of a new and terrifyingly resilient form of life. The planet was about to be thirsty, and that thirst would change everything. Chapter 04: The Great Drying. The transition of Arrakis from a wet world to a dry one was not a single event, but a convergence of immense, slow-moving forces. It was a planetary fever that baked away the oceans and fundamentally altered the world's character forever. The mechanisms of this profound transformation represent the long and quiet apocalypse that was the Great Drying. The first and most significant driver was atmospheric. The young planet's dense, cloudy atmosphere, rich in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from volcanic outgassing, had acted like a thick blanket, trapping heat and keeping the surface warm enough for liquid water. But atmospheres are not static. Over hundreds of millions of years, two processes began to thin this blanket. Firstly, the planet's own geology began to lock away the carbon. The hot, acidic rain that fell into the oceans reacted with the silicate rocks of the seafloor. This chemical weathering process drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and trapped it in carbonate minerals, limestone, dolomite, which were then deposited on the ocean floor. It was a planetary carbon sequestration system, operating on a geological timescale. Each ton of limestone formed was a piece of the atmospheric blanket being stitched into the planet's crust. Secondly, as the planet continued to cool internally, its volcanic activity began to wane. The great shield volcanoes that had so diligently pumped gases into the sky for eons grew quiet. The plumes from the mantle slowed, and the outgassing that had replenished the atmosphere could no longer keep pace with the carbon being lost to the rocks. The blanket was being worn thin, and not enough new thread was being woven to repair it. With a thinner atmosphere, the greenhouse effect weakened. The planet could no longer retain its heat as efficiently. The average global temperature began to fall. But this did not bring a gentle, temperate climate. Instead, it triggered a series of feedback loops. Cooler temperatures meant more water vapor froze into ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, forming high-altitude clouds that reflected more sunlight back into space, further cooling the planet in a process known as increasing the planet's albedo. This cooling had a paradoxical effect. While the overall temperature dropped, the planet became drier. Colder air holds less moisture. The epic, globe-spanning rains began to falter. Evaporation from the ocean's surfaces, while still occurring, was not being replenished as quickly by rainfall. The water cycle, the great engine of a wet climate, began to sputter and slow down. Another critical factor was the planet's core. As the liquid outer core continued to cool and solidify over geological time, the dynamo that generated the planet's protective magnetic field weakened. A weaker magnetosphere provided less of a shield against the solar wind from Canopus. This stream of charged particles began to more effectively abrade the upper layers of the atmosphere, stripping away lighter gases. This included water vapor, which was broken down by solar radiation into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen, being the lightest element, escaped into space, lost to the planet forever. Arrakis was, in a very real sense, bleeding its water into the void. The result was the slow, heartbreaking retreat of the oceans. Over millennia, the shorelines crept inward. What were once deep seas became shallow, sun-drenched lagoons. These lagoons, cut off from the main bodies of water, evaporated quickly, leaving behind immense, glittering plains of salt and other evaporite minerals. The great salt pans of Arrakis are the tombstones of these lost seas. Any once thriving microbial life in the oceans faced a crisis. As the water grew saltier and the environment more extreme, only the most resilient organisms could have survived, perhaps retreating to deep subterranean aquifers or entering dormant, spore-like states. The changing climate reshaped the land. With less rain, the rivers that had carved the Great Canyons began to run dry, becoming seasonal wadis and eventually, nothing more than sandy, winding channels. The wind, once a secondary force of erosion, became the primary sculptor of the landscape. It picked up the sediments from the dry lake beds and the weathered rock from the mountains, and began its patient work of abrasion. The age of water was ending, and the age of wind was beginning. This process was not uniform. Some regions, perhaps near the poles or in deep rift valleys, may have held onto their water for longer, becoming vast, isolated oases in a slowly expanding desert. These areas would have been the last refuges for any aquatic life, final desperate pockets of a dying biome. But the global trend was undeniable. The planet was drying out, from the equator to the poles. It is a strong scholarly inference that this prolonged drying period was the crucible in which the unique biology of Arrakis was forged. Any life that was to survive this transition had to adapt to increasing scarcity of water. An evolutionary pressure of immense power was being applied to the planet's biosphere. The central problem for life was no longer temperature or chemical balance, but simple, devastating thirst. Survival now depended on the ability to find, conserve, and control water with ruthless efficiency. The Great Drying was not an act of destruction, but of selection. It selected for a future that was radically different from the planet's past. It cleared the stage of its aquatic cast and set the scene for a new set of actors to emerge. It created the conditions, the aridity, the specific atmospheric composition, the exposed mineral-rich crust that were necessary for the next, and most famous, a chapter of the planet's ecological history to begin, the spice cycle. As this pivotal era concluded, the planet was transformed yet again. The oceans were gone, reduced to vast, sterile salt flats. The air was thin, cold, and dry. The wind was now the dominant force, a restless, sanding hand that never ceases its work. The planet was a pale, ochre-colored sphere, a world seemingly on the verge of biological death. But it was not dead. It was waiting. Life, if it had survived, had retreated into the rock, into the deep places, into hiding. And in this hiding, in this desperate adaptation to thirst, a new and revolutionary organism was about to appear. The architect of the desert was coming. The Great Drying was its genesis, and the sand its kingdom. Chapter 05, Seeds in the Sand, the First Hidden Architects. In the wake of the Great Drying, the surface of Arrakis was a desolate, wind-swept expanse of rock and mineral dust. The vast majority of any life that had existed in the ancient oceans was now extinct. The planet appeared sterile, but deep within the porous rock, in subterranean aquifers, and in the brine-rich layers beneath the salt pans, life clung on. And it was here, in the darkness and under immense pressure, that a great evolutionary leap occurred. This part of the history is a matter of careful reconstruction, a scholarly inference based on the biology that would one day dominate the planet. The fossil record of this transitional period is almost non-existent. What follows is the most plausible origin story for the creature that would become the vector for the spice itself, the sandtrout. This organism was likely a small, simple creature, perhaps descended from the extremophilic life of the primordial seas. Its primary evolutionary challenge was the conservation of water in an increasingly arid world. Through countless generations, it developed a radical and profound adaptation. It learned not just to conserve water for itself, but to actively sequester it from the environment. it became a living sponge, a biological pump. This creature, in its proto-form, was likely no larger than a human hand. It had a flattened, leathery body, semi-porous and capable of absorbing any moisture it encountered. It could sense minute traces of humidity in the rock and soil and would migrate toward it. When it found a pocket of water, it would surround it, encysst it, creating a small, living, watertight barrier around the precious liquid. This was not for immediate consumption. It was for storage and, crucially, for reproduction. These early sandtrout or proto-sandtrout multiplied in the presence of water. A single drop of water could become a nucleus for a colony. They would form vast, interconnected fungal-like networks deep underground, linking pockets of moisture and creating a hidden, subterranean reservoir of life and water. They were the first architects of the new Arrakis ecology, working silently, invisibly, beneath the surface. Their existence had a profound effect on the planet's remaining surface water. Any small pool left over from a rare rain shower, any seep from a deep spring, would be immediately invaded by these creatures. They would swarm the water, lock it away, and pull it down beneath the surface. From an outside perspective, it would look as though the planet was actively repelling water, making itself drier. The sandtrout were the agents of this final desiccation, the zealous enforcers of the planet's arid destiny. They were, in essence, terraformers. But their work created a desert, not a garden. Now, we come to the critical juncture, the alchemical moment that would define Arrakis forever. The water that the sandtrout were sequestering was not pure. It was a chemical brine, rich in the unique minerals of the planet's crust. Inside the living cysts formed by the creatures, a strange metabolic process began. The organisms were not just storing the water, they were processing it. They were catalysts in a reaction between the captured water and the planet's geology. Within the cyst, this biochemical reaction produced a complex molecular byproduct, a slurry of organic, fungal material. When a critical mass of this material accumulated, or when the cyst was exposed to a sudden change in pressure or temperature, the reaction would become explosive. The trapped water would be instantly decomposed. The resulting pre-spice mass, as it would later be termed, would erupt with tremendous force, killing the sandtrout involved and releasing a cloud of their spores and the gaseous byproducts of the reaction into the atmosphere. This was the birth of the spice cycle. A deep subterranean explosion, a spice blow, was the creature's violent and transformative reproductive act. The gases released, rich in oxygen and other compounds, began to slowly and permanently alter the planet's thin atmosphere, making it breathable over many millennia for more complex, oxygen-dependent life. The spores, scattered by the blow, would lie dormant until they encountered another trace of water, beginning the cycle anew. And the spice itself, the melange, was the aged and oxidized remnant of that pre-spice mass, exposed to the sun and air on the surface after a blow. It was the waste product of a bizarre life cycle, a fossilized geriatric fungus with extraordinary properties. Its unique molecular structure, a result of the equally unique biology of the sandtrout and the geology of Arrakis, had psychoactive and geriatric effects on the few off-world species, like humans, who would eventually encounter it. But to the planet itself, it was simply a part of a cycle. These first hidden architects were working on a planetary scale. With each passing millennium, they locked away more and more of the planet's free water, driving the surface to absolute aridity. They built the desert, they manufactured the air, and they created the spice. The entire ecosystem of Dune, the one that would confront the first human settlers, was the product of this one. Extraordinary creatures' desperate, brilliant adaptation to thirst. The surface of Arrakis, scoured by wind and baked by the sun, now began to accumulate a new substance: sand. The relentless wind erosion broke down the mountains, the rocks, the ancient basaltic plains, into fine particles. This sand, rich in silica and other minerals, began to cover the landscape, burying the old world of stone under a new world of shifting dunes. This new, sandy environment was the perfect medium for the next stage of the sandtrout's life cycle. The desert was not their enemy, it was their creation, their garden, their kingdom. The history of the planet can now be seen as a single, continuous story. The fiery birth determined the mineral composition. The long cooling allowed for the oceans. The memory of water provided the raw material for life. The great drying provided the evolutionary pressure. And now, the emergence of the sandtrout provides the mechanism for the creation of the desert itself. The planet was not a victim of its environment, it was the creator of it. A new question arises. What becomes of a creature that hoards water and triggers explosive chemical reactions? What happens when this cycle, repeated over millions of years, begins to mature? The answer is a transformation even more profound and terrifying. The small seeds in the sand were about to give rise to giants. Chapter 06. When quiet things become colossi. The life cycle of the sandtrout was established. Deep beneath the surface, it diligently encapsulated water, creating the pre-spice mass that would erupt in a blow, releasing spores and enriching the atmosphere. This cycle could have continued indefinitely, a hidden, subterranean engine reshaping the planet's chemistry. But evolution is relentless. A stable cycle is often a platform for emergence, for the development of new and more complex forms. Not all sandtrout spores would find a drop of water and begin the cycle anew. Some would find themselves in a different environment, one not of scarcity, but of abundance, an abundance of sand. This speculative thread leads to the most iconic life form on Arrakis, the great sandworm, Shai-Hulud. The sandworm is not a separate species from the sandtrout. It is the mature, adult stage of the very same creature. It is the culmination of the cycle, a transformation so profound it is almost mythological. Let us trace this metamorphosis. A small percentage of sandtrout, perhaps through a genetic quirk or specific environmental triggers, do not remain in their small water-hoarding form. Instead of seeking water, they begin to thrive in the dry, oxygen-rich environment of the deep sand. They begin to grow. The leathery, flattened body of the sandtrout fuses with others of its kind, forming a larger, composite organism. It develops a segmented body, tough and fibrous, capable of burrowing through sand and rock. It is no longer a scavenger of water, but a consumer of sand, filtering it for organic nutrients, the remnants of the ancient biosphere, and for minerals it needs to fuel its immense growth. This is the larva stage, the small sandworm, the little maker that the Fremen would one day learn to summon. These creatures, perhaps only a few meters long, are the intermediates. They are voracious, active, and represent a critical shift in the planet's ecology. For the first time, a large, mobile life form actively shapes the physical environment of the dunes. Their burrowing aerates the sand, mixes the layers, and brings the spice, deposited by ancient blows, closer to the surface. And still, they grow. Fueled by the planet's unique chemistry and the energy of its sun, their metabolism, a form of low-temperature silicon-based chemistry, allows for immense size. The small larva becomes a juvenile worm of 100 meters, then an adult of many hundreds, and in the deep desert, an ancient colossal creature that can exceed a kilometer in length. The quiet, hidden architect has become a colossus, a true leviathan of the land. The adult sandworm is a creature of sublime and terrifying simplicity. It has no need for eyes in the darkness of the sand sea. It navigates by sensing vibration, by feeling the rhythmic pulse of the desert. Its body is a vast, mobile chemical factory, a huge crystalline mouth filled with thousands of sharp, inwardly curving teeth, grinds sand and rock. Its internal temperatures are incredibly high, a slow, biological furnace that can smelt silica and process minerals. It produces oxygen as a waste product, which it vents into the atmosphere, continuing the work of the spice blows on an even grander scale. The sandworms of Arrakis are the planet's lungs. With the emergence of these giants, the very nature of the planet's surface changes. The dune seas are no longer static landscapes, shaped only by wind. They are living corridors, the territory of the worms. The worms' constant movement, their swimming through the sand, creates the patterns of the desert. Their burrowing prevents the sand from ever compacting into sandstone, keeping the erg vast, shifting, and alive. They are the apex predators, the keystone species, and the dominant geological force all in one. And they are inextricably linked to the spice. The worms are fiercely territorial and will attack any rhythmic, sustained vibration on the surface of the sand. This is not out of malice, but out of a deep biological imperative. They are the guardians of the desert, the protectors of the arid environment in which they thrive. Water is a deadly poison to them. A sufficient quantity can overwhelm their metabolism, causing a catastrophic chain reaction that kills the worm. And it is in this death that the cycle comes full circle. The dying worm's body decomposes back into its constituent parts, thousands upon thousands of sandtrout, released to seek out any trace of water and begin the process of creating the pre-spice mass once more. The worm is the adult, the sandtrout is the child. One cannot exist without the other. The worm protects the desert from water, and the sandtrout eliminates water to protect the desert. It is a perfectly closed, self-perpetuating ecological loop. The planet has created a life form that actively defends and maintains the very conditions that allow it to exist. Arrakis is no longer just a desert planet. It is a planet that has chosen to be a desert. The soundscape of this new Arrakis changed. The whisper of the wind was now joined by a new sound. The immense, rustling, grinding passage of a worm moving deep beneath the dunes. The silence of the desert is punctuated by the distant roar of a surfacing worm, a sound that can travel for kilometers. The very ground hums with a latent power. Rhythm has become a matter of life and death. A steady, repeated footstep, the hum of a machine, any unnatural cadence is a summons, an invitation to the creature that rules this world. Life here must learn to walk without rhythm, to blend in with the natural, chaotic sounds of the wind and the sand. The rise of Shai-Hulud marks the maturation of the Arrakis ecosystem. The planet has found its equilibrium. It is a harsh, dangerous, and utterly unique state of being. The quiet, microscopic processes that began after the Great Drying have culminated in the largest and most awe-inspiring life form known to history. The Colossus now reigns supreme. Its life creates the spice. Its breath creates the air. Its movement shapes the land. Its existence defines the rules of survival. For countless millennia, this was the state of Arrakis. A world of sand and worms, of spice blows and Coriolis storms. A world waiting. The stage was now fully set. The environment was complete. All that was missing were the players who would walk upon it, those who would discover the desert's treasure and confront its god. The planet was ready for its first visitors. The quiet things had become colossi, and these giants now waited in the deep sand, listening for the first, fateful, rhythmic footsteps. Chapter 07, Breath of the Desert, the Spice Cycle. Having established the roles of the sandtrout and the sandworm, the architects and guardians of the desert, it is time to focus on the substance that binds their life cycle together, the material that would one day draw the gaze of the entire galaxy, the spice, Melange. To understand Arrakis, the spice must be understood not as a commodity, but as a biological and planetary process. It is the breath of the desert, the scent on the wind, the chemical soul of the world. The cycle begins in darkness, deep beneath the sand, in the hidden places where the last vestiges of the planet's water are trapped. Here, the sandtrout, the juvenile form of the worm, performs its primary biological function. It finds a pocket of water and encapsulates it, forming a living barrier. Within this cyst, the sandtrout's metabolism begins to work its strange alchemy, mixing the water with the planet's unique mineral substrate and its own fungal enzymes. This creates the unstable, volatile substance, known to science as a pre-spice mass. This mass grows, a pocket of immense potential energy, a chemical bomb waiting for a trigger. When the pressure builds to a critical point, the reaction can no longer be contained. The mass explodes. This is the spice blow, a moment of profound transformation. The trapped water is consumed in the reaction, utterly destroyed. The sandtrout that formed the cyst are killed, their bodies and spores scattered in the blast. A huge cloud of gas and matter then erupts onto the desert surface. The sensory experience of a spice blow from a safe distance would be dramatic. The ground would tremble. The sand in the distance would heave upwards, followed by a low, powerful roar as a vast mushroom cloud of purple and orange gas billows into the sky. This cloud carries the spores of the sandtrout, which will ride the winds to find new homes. It also carries the raw, unrefined spice mass, which rains down and mixes with the sand. Most importantly, the cloud contains a burst of pure, breathable oxygen, a byproduct of the violent chemical reaction. These blows, occurring over millions of years, are what enriched the thin, nitrogen-heavy atmosphere of post-drying Arrakis, making it survivable for oxygen-breathing life. Each spice blow is a breath, the planet exhaling the air that life will need. The Fremen proverb that the spice is the breath of Shai-Hulud is a deep, literal truth. Once on the surface, the next stage of the process begins. The raw spice mass, exposed to the sun and the dry air, begins to mature. It oxidizes and ages, its complex molecules breaking down and reforming. This aging process, which can take years, is what turns the volatile pre-spice mass into the stable geriatric spice, Melange. The cinnamon scent that hangs in the air of Arrakis is the scent of this planetary scale fermentation. The spice is not mined from the ground like a mineral. It is harvested, like a ripened fruit, from the surface of the sand. The color of the sand itself is a clue to the presence of spice. Patches of sand with a deep, purplish cinnamon hue indicate a rich, recent deposit. Over time, the wind mixes it, dilutes it, and spreads it across the dunes, creating a world dusted with the precious substance. The entire planet is, in effect, a giant pharmaceutical factory, and the spice is its ubiquitous, miraculous product. The worms are central to this cycle. They are drawn to the spice. It is not their primary food source. They consume sand for minerals, but the spice contains concentrated nutrients and chemicals vital for their immense metabolism. They can detect the scent of a fresh spice blow from incredible distances and will migrate toward it. A rich spice field is also a rich hunting ground for the worms. This creates a perilous, dynamic relationship for anyone who would seek to harvest the spice. The very place where the treasure is most abundant is also the place where the guardians are most likely to be found. To collect the spice is to invade the worm's territory, to trespass in its cathedral. Furthermore, the worms are essential for the continuation of the cycle. They are the protectors of the absolute aridity that the sandtrout require. Their violent intolerance of water ensures that the desert remains a desert. They are also the endpoint of the cycle. When a great worm dies, its body decomposes back into its constituent parts, thousands upon thousands of sandtrout, released to be the cycle's beginning. The worm is the phoenix, and the sandtrout are the ashes from which it is reborn. The cycle is thus complete and self-sustaining. Sandtrout find water and create a pre-spice mass. The mass explodes in a spice blow, releasing oxygen, spores, and raw spice. The raw spice ages on the surface into melange. The sandworms, which grew from sandtrout spores, guard the desert and are drawn to the spice. The death of a worm releases a new generation of sandtrout. It is a perfect, elegant, and ruthless system that dictates the planet's geology, atmosphere, and biology. The breath of the desert is a cycle of life, death, and transformation, on a scale that beggars the imagination. The spice is not just a drug or a treasure. It is a physical manifestation of this cycle. To consume the spice is to consume a piece of the planet's soul, to take part in its strange and ancient metabolism. For untold ages, this cycle continued in perfect isolation. The planet breathed, the worms ruled, and the spice aged silently in the sunday. There were no minds to comprehend its significance, no markets to give it value. It was simply a fact of the world, like the wind or the rising of the moons. But even in this isolation, the scent of the spice was being carried on the solar winds. Its unique molecular signature was a whisper, a promise traveling across the void. Sooner or later, an intelligence would be curious enough to seek the source of that strange and wonderful scent. The breath of the desert was also a beacon, and the first ships were, inevitably, on their way. Chapter 08, Machines Meet the Dune. Into the perfectly balanced, self-contained world of Arrakis, a new element was introduced: intelligence, and with it, technology. The first visitors, whoever they were, did not arrive on foot. They came in ships, with tools, sensors, and machines. It was here that they learned the first and most brutal lesson of the desert planet. Arrakis listens. This part of the history relies on a scholarly inference, piecing together the physics of the desert with the fragmented legends that speak of early, failed ventures. These were not large-scale colonization efforts, but more likely small, tentative explorations. Prospecting teams, scientific surveyors, perhaps even religious pilgrims drawn by the strange astronomical properties of the Canopus system. Their records, if any were kept, have long since been ground to dust. What remains is the lesson, a piece of wisdom that would eventually become a core tenet of survival on Dune. Consider an early survey team setting up their first outpost. They choose a spot that seems stable, a flat basin between towering dunes. They unpack their equipment, generators, seismic sensors, drilling rigs, confident, protected by the best technology their civilization can offer. They power up a generator. It hums with a steady, consistent frequency. They begin to deploy their seismic thumper, a device designed to send rhythmic pulses into the ground to map the subterranean strata. They are looking for minerals, for water, for knowledge. But their methods, honed on 100 other worlds, are a death sentence here. To the desert, these rhythmic, monotonous vibrations are a signal, an unnatural intrusion into the chaotic, wind-driven soundscape of the dunes. To the true master of the desert, the sandworm, these signals are an unignorable summons, a territorial challenge. The vibrations travel through the sand, a medium that transmits them with incredible efficiency. Miles away, a great worm, perhaps resting deep beneath the erg, senses this alien pulse. It is not a sound it hears, but a feeling, a deep thrumming in its segmented body that awakens a primal, territorial instinct. The worm turns. It begins to move toward the source of the vibration, not with anger, but with a kind of massive, inexorable certainty. It does not rush. It is a creature of immense patience. Its passage is a deep, grinding tremor, a growing earthquake that the surveyor's own instruments would register with increasing alarm. They might mistake it for natural seismic activity at first, but the signal is not random. It is directional. It is coming for them. The end is swift and absolute. The sand around the outpost begins to heave and swell. A great, circular mouth, a kilometer wide and lined with crystalline teeth, erupts from the desert floor. The outpost, with all its machinery and personnel, is simply gone, swallowed in an instant. The sand rushes in to fill the void, and within minutes, the wind begins to smooth over the disturbance. An hour later, there is no sign that anything was ever there. The desert has erased the intrusion. This scene, or one like it, must have been repeated many times in the early history of off-world contact. Arrakis was a graveyard for conventional technology. Ground vehicles with combustion engines, walking machinery, anything that produced a steady, rhythmic pattern of movement or sound was doomed. The planet itself was the predator, and the worms were its teeth. This led to the development of what might be called an acoustic ecology. Survival depended on understanding how sound and vibration travel through the sand. Early survivors, if there were any, would have learned this lesson through brutal trial and error. They would have noticed that the worms did not attack random, chaotic noises. A rock slide, the shifting of a dune in a Coriolis storm, these were natural sounds which the worms ignored. The key was rhythm, monotony, predictability. The question became how one operates in such an environment. A speculative thread suggests that the first successful visitors were those who learned to mimic the desert. They learned to move irregularly, to walk in shuffling, broken steps, a movement that would one day be perfected by the Fremen into the sandwalk. They learned to design machines that operated in chaotic bursts of activity, rather than with a steady hum. They learned the value of silence. The very air of Arrakis teaches this lesson. The wind is never silent, but it is also never monotonous. Its whisper and roar are constantly changing in pitch and intensity. To survive, one had to become like the wind. This unique environmental pressure had a profound effect on the kind of technological footprint any visitor could leave. Large, permanent structures with foundations deep in the rock were possible, provided they were built on high, rocky outcrops where the worms could not reach them. But any activity out on the sand sea, any attempt at large-scale mining or transportation, was fraught with peril. This is why the early history of Arrakis is an archaeology of absence. There are no great ruins of forgotten cities in the sand, no remnants of vast industrial projects. The desert did not permit them. It consumed them. Any evidence of these first encounters was temporary, fragile, and ultimately erased. The machines of outsiders met the Dune, and the Dune won. It was not a battle of force, but of principle. The principles of industrial technology, efficiency, repetition, rhythm were the very things the planet was biologically programmed to destroy. Arrakis demanded a different kind of thinking. It required not conquest, but adaptation, not force, but subtlety. It was a world that could not be tamed by machines. It had to be understood by minds. This fundamental truth would shape all future interactions with the planet. The great powers of the galaxy, with their fleets and armies, could hold the planet's single rocky fortress, Arrakis. They could control the sky, but they could never control the sand. The deep desert belonged to the worms, and to anyone humble enough to learn the worms' laws. The first footfalls of outsiders were heavy, rhythmic, and short-lived. The next wave of visitors would have to learn to walk more softly. Chapter 09, First Footfalls. Visitors, not inhabitants. Who were they? These first intrepid souls who dared to set foot on the world that machines could not conquer? The historical record is silent, a page wiped clean by sand and time. But by examining the nature of the planet and the motivations that drive exploration, a plausible picture can be constructed. This is a chapter of scholarly inference, a thoughtful imagining of the visitors who came before the inhabitants. It is unlikely that the first arrivals were part of a grand imperial expansion. A world like Arrakis, hostile and enigmatic, would not have been a prime target for colonization. It is more probable that the first footfalls belonged to small, specialized groups, each with their own compelling reason for braving the planet's dangers. Three possibilities present themselves. First, there were the prospectors. The galaxy is vast, and the search for new resources is eternal. A ship on a long-range survey mission might have detected unusual energy signatures or mineral readings from the system. Intrigued, a small team might have been dispatched to investigate. These would have been tough, resourceful individuals, accustomed to harsh environments. They would have landed their ship on a high rock mesa, safe from the worms, and conducted their surveys using small, airborne drones and remote sensors. Their initial findings would have been puzzling. The planet was extraordinarily rich in certain common minerals, but the seismic instability, which they would have mistaken for tectonic activity, and the sheer logistical difficulty of operating on the surface would have made large-scale extraction seem impossible. They might have discovered the spice, perhaps collecting a sample from a recent blow. They would have noted its strange organic properties, its intoxicating scent. But without understanding its true value or the scale of its production, they might have dismissed it as a biological curiosity, a local fungus with peculiar chemistry. The prospectors would have logged their findings, a geologically rich but dangerously unstable world, and moved on, the true prize having slipped through their fingers. Their mark on the world would have been minimal, a scorched landing site on a remote butte, a few discarded sensor probes, quickly buried by the sand. A second, and very different, type of visitor could have been pilgrims or mystics. The star Canopus holds a significant place in the mythology of many ancient cultures. Furthermore, the unique orbital mechanics of Arrakis and its moons might have created celestial alignments of deep astrological or religious significance. A small, devout group, seeking a place of quiet contemplation or a prophesied convergence, might have seen Arrakis not as a resource to be exploited, but as a sacred site. These visitors would have approached the planet with a sense of reverence and caution. Their goal was not to conquer, but to experience. They would have been more attuned to the rhythms of the desert, more likely to observe and adapt rather than impose their will. They might have been the first to discover the psychoactive properties of the spice, not as a commodity, but as a sacrament, a tool for achieving altered states of consciousness. They might have interpreted the great worms not as monsters, but as divine manifestations, the spirits of the planet. These pilgrims would have left few physical traces, perhaps a small, hand-carved shrine in a hidden cave, or a pattern of rocks arranged on a high plateau to mark a celestial event. Their legacy would not have been in artifacts, but in ideas. The first whispers of the desert's holiness, the first inkling of its deep spiritual power. These whispers, carried off-world, might have evolved into the myths that would one day draw the Zen Sunni wanderers to the planet. Third, one must consider the possibility of refugees or exiles. Somewhere in the sprawling history of the galaxy, a group may have needed a hiding place, a world so hostile and obscure that no one would think to look for them there. Arrakis would have been a perfect, if brutal, sanctuary. A small community, perhaps a few hundred strong, could have established a foothold on one of the large rocky mesas that served as islands in the sand sea. This group would have faced the steepest learning curve. They were not visiting. They were trying to survive. They would have been forced to learn the planet's secrets the hard way. They would have learned about the worms through deadly encounters. They would have learned to capture water from the air with wind traps, a technology they may have invented out of sheer necessity. They would have learned which native plants, the tough, scrubby vegetation found on the rock outcroppings, were edible. This group, more than any other, would have been the proto-Fremen. They would have been the first to develop a true desert literacy. However, it is a speculative thread that such a settlement could not have lasted indefinitely. Life on the rock mesas would have been incredibly harsh. Resources would be scarce. The psychological toll of living in constant danger, penned in on a small island of rock, would have been immense. Over generations, their technology would have failed without access to industrial replacements. Their numbers would have dwindled. Perhaps they eventually died out, or perhaps they managed to repair their ship and leave, carrying with them a trove of hard-won knowledge about the desert planet. Their legacy would be the most significant, the first real blueprint for survival. These three groups, the prospector, the pilgrim, the refugee, represent the likely character of the first footfalls on Arrakis. They were not conquerors. They were visitors, transients, temporary figures on a landscape that measured time in millennia. They did not change the planet changed them. Each group, in its own way, would have contributed to the growing reputation of Arrakis in the galactic consciousness, a place of danger, a place of mystery, and a place of strange, untapped power. They were the first to look upon the face of the desert, and the stories they carried away, fragmented and distorted by time, would set the stage for the next wave of arrivals who would come seeking the source of the desert's intoxicating breath. Chapter 10. Amber in the Air. The First Whispers of Spice. The first visitors came and went, leaving little more than faint echoes in the sand. But some of them, particularly the prospectors and the pilgrims, would have carried away something of immense significance: physical samples of the spice melange. Back in the sterile laboratories and quiet monasteries of other worlds, this strange, cinnamon-scented dust would have presented a profound puzzle. A xenobotanist in a corporate lab, placing a few grams of melange under a spectroscope, would find readings unlike anything ever seen. The molecular structure would be extraordinarily complex, a long-chain organic molecule intertwined with inorganic elements in a way that defied easy classification. It was clearly biological in origin, a product of some kind of life, yet it possessed properties more akin to a mineral. Its most baffling quality would be its geriatric effect. In cell cultures, it didn't just halt aging. It seemed to subtly reverse it, promoting vitality and longevity. The implications were staggering. A mystic, a member of a contemplative order, ingesting a small amount of the spice as a sacrament, would have a transformative experience. It was not a simple hallucinogen, causing visions and distortions. It was an expansion of consciousness. The mystic might experience moments of prescience, fleeting glimpses of possible futures, a sense of interconnectedness with the universe. The spice was not just a key to a long life, but a key that could unlock the doors of perception. These discoveries would have been fragmented, isolated, and likely kept secret. A corporation that found a potential fountain of youth would not announce it to the galaxy. A religious order that found a path to enlightenment would guard it for its initiates. But secrets have a way of leaking. Whispers would begin to circulate in the highest echelons of power. A new substance, found on a remote, dangerous desert world with unbelievable properties. This would have created a quiet, intense demand. But the problem was supply. The early reports from the prospectors would have described Arrakis as lethally dangerous. The worms, the storms, the lack of water, it was a logistical nightmare. The first attempts at systematic harvesting would have been cautious and small-scale. A corporation might fund a small, heavily armed expedition with the goal of securing a few hundred kilograms of the substance. These early spice hunters would have faced the same problems as the first surveyors. Their machinery would attract the worms. Their harvesting techniques would be clumsy and inefficient. They might have tried using large, armored vehicles to scoop up spice-rich sand, only to see them devoured. They might have tried sending in teams on foot, only to lose them to the elements or a misstep. The cost in lives and equipment for a small amount of spice would have been astronomical. A key scholarly inference is that these early failures taught the first exploiters a crucial lesson. The spice could not be mined. It had to be gathered. The model of industrial resource extraction was useless on Arrakis. This realization led to a shift in strategy. Instead of heavy machinery, they turned to lighter, more mobile technology. Ornithopters, small, agile flying machines, were the key. They could fly low over the dunes, identify a rich spice field after a blow, land quickly, and allow a small team to gather what they could before the inevitable arrival of a worm. This method was still incredibly dangerous. The window of opportunity was small. The thopters themselves, if they landed too heavily or remained on the ground for too long, could be at risk. But it was a viable, if precarious, method of extraction. For a time, spice harvesting was likely the most dangerous profession in the galaxy, attracting only the most desperate or the most daring. The spice that trickled into the galactic markets would have been rarer than any precious metal, more valuable than any jewel. It would have been used only by the very wealthy, the most powerful. The Padishah Emperor, the leaders of the great houses, the highest echelons of the Spacing Guild, they would have been the first to benefit from its life-extending properties. And for the Guild, the spice would have held a particular fascination. Their navigators, immersed in tanks and already mutated by their specialized training, were constantly seeking ways to enhance their ability to navigate the folds of space-time. The prescient qualities of the spice would have been of supreme interest to them. But even as they consumed it, its origin remained a mystery. They knew it came from Arrakis, but they did not understand the cycle. They did not know about the worms and the sandtrout. They saw the spice as a geological deposit, a freak of nature, not the product of a living, breathing ecosystem. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that their extraction efforts would always be inefficient and would never be stable. They were skimming the surface of a vast ocean, unaware of the currents and creatures that moved in its depth. The amber scent of the spice was now in the air of the imperial court. The whispers had become a quiet roar of demand. Arrakis was no longer an obscure, forgotten world. It was the sole source of the most valuable substance in the universe. The planet was now a prize. And the great powers of the galaxy were beginning to realize that whoever could solve the puzzle of Arrakis, whoever could control the spice, would hold a power unlike any other. The age of quiet visits was over. The age of conquest was about to begin. The first whispers had set the stage for a storm that would engulf the entire Imperium. Chapter 11. Blueprints for Rain, Terraforming Dreams. With the value of spice established and the control of Arrakis becoming a strategic imperative, a new and ambitious dream took hold in the minds of the planet's new masters: terraforming. The logic seemed simple and compelling. The dangers of Arrakis, the worms, the storms, the aridity, were all products of its desert environment. If the environment could be changed, if the planet could be made green and temperate, then the spice could be harvested in safety and abundance. The blueprints for rain were drawn up, filled with the hubris and technological optimism of an empire that believed any world could be bent to its will. This was not a new idea. Humanity had been shaping worlds for thousands of years. The principles of planetary engineering were well understood. The initial surveys of Arrakis had revealed the truth of its past, the geological evidence of its lost oceans. The water, they reasoned, was not truly gone. It was simply locked away in the planet's poles, in deep subterranean aquifers, and in the very chemistry of the rocks. The challenge was to release it. The first attempts were likely small-scale and experimental. On the high mesas and in the shelter of the shield wall, where the worms could not interfere, the first planetologists, as they came to be called, set up their laboratories. They planted hardy, genetically engineered grasses and shrubs, hoping to create a root system that could stabilize the soil and increase humidity. They erected massive windbreaks, great fences designed to slow the force of the Coriolis storms and encourage the deposition of dust, the first step in creating topsoil. One of the most ambitious early projects would have been the construction of wind traps. These were not the small, efficient dew collectors that would later be used by the Fremen, but immense industrial structures, towering fins, hundreds of meters high, designed to cool the passing air and condense its minute moisture content, channeling the resulting drops of water into vast underground cisterns. The dream was to accumulate enough water to begin filling the ancient lake beds. Let us follow a speculative thread and imagine the fate of one such project. A massive wind trap is constructed in a deep, protected canyon. For years, it works flawlessly, slowly but surely, collecting thousands of liters of water. The engineers are triumphant. They have created an oasis. They begin to plant crops. They dream of forests and rivers, but they have failed to understand the planet's true nature. The presence of so much concentrated, free water in one place does not go unnoticed by the planet's hidden architects. The spores of the sandtrout are everywhere, dormant in the dust. They are drawn to the immense humidity. They find their way into the cistern, and there they find a paradise. They multiply at an explosive rate, swarming the water, encapsulating it, pulling it back into the planet's deep biology. The engineers would watch in horror as their precious water simply vanished. The level in the cistern would drop, not from evaporation, but from biological sequestration. And then, the inevitable would happen. Deep beneath the oasis, a pre-spice mass of unprecedented size would form. The resulting spice blow would not just destroy the wind trap and the surrounding settlement. It would obliterate the entire canyon, reshaping the very geography of the region. This would have been a terrifying lesson. Arrakis fights back. The planet's ecosystem was not a passive victim to be reshaped. It was an active, powerful system that resisted any change to its arid state. Water was not the key to life here. It was the trigger for a violent, destructive reaction. Undeterred, the Imperial engineers would have turned to even grander, more arrogant schemes. They might have tried atmospheric seeding, sending fleets of ships into the upper atmosphere to release chemicals designed to promote cloud formation. This may have produced rain, but it would have been a bitter victory. The rain, falling on the superheated sand, would have created immense storms of superheated steam, scalding the surface. And any water that did reach the ground would simply have started the sandtrout cycle anew, leading to more and more violent spice blows. They were feeding the very system they were trying to destroy. The most audacious plan, one that became a recurring dream for centuries, was to melt the polar ice caps. The technology existed. Orbital mirrors could focus the sun's rays, or targeted orbital strikes could release enough energy to vaporize the ice. The result would be a massive, temporary increase in atmospheric water vapor. But the planetologists who modeled this scenario came to a chilling conclusion. The sudden release of so much water would not create gentle seas. It would trigger a runaway greenhouse effect, boiling the new oceans and turning Arrakis into a steam-choked inferno, destroying the spice cycle entirely. It was a cure that would kill the patient. The dream of a green Arrakis was a beautiful, seductive, and ultimately, a fatal illusion. The planet was not a blank slate waiting to be painted with water and life. It was a complex, interlocking system that had achieved a perfect, if harsh, equilibrium. The spice, the worms, the sand, the aridity, they were not separate elements. They were all part of a single, vast organism. To change one part was to risk the collapse of the whole. The blueprints for rain were quietly shelved. The great terraforming projects were abandoned. The ruins of wind traps and the scars of failed agricultural experiments were left to be scoured by the wind. The Imperial presence on Arrakis resigned itself to a state of perpetual siege, clinging to its fortified enclaves, content to harvest the spice by perilous means, but no longer daring to dream of taming the world that produced it. The planet had taught its masters a lesson in humility. It had proven that some systems are too vast, too ancient, and too powerful to be rushed. the desert would remain the desert, and the future of the planet would belong not to those who tried to change it, but to those who could learn to live within its uncompromising laws. Chapter 12. The Desert Edits History. On a world like Arrakis, history is not written in stone. It is written in sand, and the sand is a merciless editor. The wind, the worms, and the sheer scale of the landscape conspire to erase the past, to grind down artifacts and monuments into anonymous dust. To study the ancient history of Arrakis is to practice an archaeology of absence, to learn to read the clues in what is missing, and to understand that the desert preserves memories in its own subtle and unforgiving way. Consider the primary force of this erasure: the wind. The Coriolis storms of Arrakis are legendary, vast weather systems that can rage for weeks, with winds exceeding 700 kilometers per hour. These are not simple storms. They are mobile, planetary-scale sandblasters. A storm can strip paint from a starship's hull, etch patterns into hardened steel, and demolish any structure not built of the strongest materials. Over millennia, this constant wind-driven abrasion grinds down entire mountain ranges. The great basaltic formations from the planet's volcanic youth are being slowly, patiently sanded into oblivion. The particles from this erosion become the sand of the dune seas. Every grain of sand on Arrakis is a tiny fragment of the planet's older, rocky past. The dunes themselves are the pulverized archives of the world's geological history. What hope does a small, man-made artifact have against such a force? The ruins of an early prospector camp, a forgotten shrine, a crashed ornithopter, all are subject to this relentless editing. First, they are buried by the shifting dunes. Then, over centuries, the abrasive sand, driven by the wind, scours them, weathers them, and eventually dismantles them molecule by molecule. The desert does not just hide the past, it consumes it. This is why there are no ancient cities on Arrakis, no equivalent of Earth's pyramids or Rome's Colosseum. Any civilization that tried to build on the sand would have seen its creations vanish within a few generations. The only places where history can cling on are the high, rocky outcrops, the islands in the sand sea that the Fremen would call seiches. Here, protected from the worst of the storms and above the reach of the worms, traces of the past can survive. A cave painting, a discarded tool, the foundation of a small dwelling. These are the rare and precious clues that archaeologists seek. But the desert also preserves things in its own way. The extreme aridity means that organic materials that would quickly rot on a wetter world can survive for thousands of years, provided they are buried quickly and deeply enough. A speculative thread suggests that deep within some of the most stable, ancient dunes, one might find a perfectly preserved body, a piece of leather, or a wooden tool from a forgotten era, mummified by the dry sand. But finding such a treasure would be like finding a single, specific grain of sand on an entire world. The landscape itself can also be read for clues to the past. The shape and orientation of the dunes can tell an experienced observer about the prevailing wind patterns over centuries. The existence of a yardang, a long, wind-carved ridge of rock, points to the direction of ancient, powerful winds and the composition of the rock that resisted them. These are not human histories, but they are the planet's own chronicle, its autobiography written in erosion. The worms are the second great editors of history. Their constant burrowing through the sand sea is a form of planetary plowing. They churn the layers of sand, bringing deep, ancient deposits to the surface and burying modern ones. They prevent the sand from ever settling and hardening into sandstone, ensuring that the desert remains a fluid, dynamic environment. An artifact buried 1,000 years ago could be brought to the surface by a worm's passage tomorrow, only to be buried again by the next sandslide. The worms ensure that the stratigraphy of the desert is a chaotic, unpredictable puzzle. This archaeology of absence teaches a profound lesson. It forces an acceptance of the limits of knowledge. A neat, linear history of pre-Fremen Arrakis cannot be reconstructed. Only fragments, hints, and echoes can be found. The desert holds its secrets close. It demands a different kind of historical thinking, one that is comfortable with speculation, with inference, and with the simple, humble admission that most of the story is lost forever. The people who would eventually master this world, the Fremen, understood this instinctively. Their history was not recorded in books or monuments, but in an oral tradition, in memory, and in the bloodlines of their people. They knew that the desert was impermanent, that only what could be carried in the mind and the heart could truly endure. They did not fight the desert's editing. They adapted to it, becoming as mobile and resilient as the sand itself. Contemplating this vast, edited landscape is a humbling experience. It forces one to see history not as a human construct, but as a planetary process. The wind that whispers over the dunes is the same wind that has erased 1,000 years of forgotten stories. The sand beneath one's feet is the dust of mountains that witness the planet's birth. In learning to read what is absent, one comes closer to understanding the true nature of Arrakis, a world that lives so intensely in its present that it has little need to preserve its past. The desert edits history, leaving only the essential truths: the rock, the wind, and the endless patient sand. Chapter 13. Rituals without a people. In the long, quiet millennia between the first Footfalls and the arrival of the Zen Sunni wanderers who would become the Fremen, the desert was not entirely empty of human life. Small, transient groups, shipwrecked crews, forgotten exiles, prospectors who had lost their way likely clung to existence in the marginal zones, the rocky highlands, where life was possible, if not easy. These were not civilizations. They were survival situations, stretched over generations, and in such environments, rituals are born. This is a speculative thread, an attempt to imagine the proto-rituals of Arrakis, the patterns of behavior that could have emerged from a deep, intuitive understanding of the desert. These were not religious ceremonies in a formal sense. They were functional rituals, actions repeated and refined over time because they enhanced survival, which were then imbued with a deeper, spiritual meaning. These were rituals without a people, in the sense that the people who practiced them are nameless and lost to history. But their echoes, their logic, may have resonated forward in time. Consider the act of walking. On any other world, it is a simple, unconscious act. On Arrakis, it is a matter of life and death. As has been discussed, rhythmic footsteps attract the worms. The first survivors would have learned this through catastrophic loss. The solution, developed over time, would be the irregular, shuffling gait that mimics the natural sounds of the desert, the sandwalk. But imagine how this practical technique would evolve into a ritual. A parent teaching a child to walk would not just be teaching them balance and movement, but a sacred pattern, a litany of step, drag, pause, step, step, slide. It would become a form of moving meditation, a constant, conscious act of attunement with the world around them. The rhythm of one's own body had to be suppressed and replaced with the non-rhythm of the desert. This physical discipline would instill a deep psychological state, a sense of humility, of being a guest in a powerful landscape, and a constant awareness of the listening presence beneath the sand. Next, consider the conservation of water. Every drop was life. The act of drinking would never be casual. It might become a slow, deliberate ritual, a moment of profound gratitude. The maintenance of a stillsuit, the hypothetical precursor to Fremen technology developed out of necessity, would be a sacred duty. The careful cleaning of the tubes, the patching of any leaks, these would be methodical, precise actions, akin to the care of a holy relic. And what of the dead? Funerary practices on a world without water would be unique. The body of a deceased tribe member represented a significant store of water, a resource too precious to be buried. The logical, if grim, conclusion is that the water would be reclaimed for the tribe. This act, born of a brutal necessity, would be surrounded by a powerful ritual to give it meaning and dignity. The water of the dead would not be seen as just water, but as the person's essence, their life force being returned to the people they loved. The ceremony would be one of continuity, of ensuring that the individual's gift of life allowed the tribe to continue. It would be the ultimate act of community, a stark and beautiful expression of the desert's first law: the tribe is all. Communication in the open desert would also have been ritualized. The voice carries far in the thin, dry air, but sound can be dangerous. These transient groups would have likely developed a complex system of hand signals, a silent language for use when moving across the dunes. This would allow them to communicate complex ideas: the presence of a worm, the location of a spice field, the direction of a coming storm without making a sound. This language of gesture would reinforce the culture of silence and observation that the desert demanded. Finally, there is the worm itself, Shai-Hulud. The creature was a constant threat, the ultimate source of danger. But it was also, as they may have discovered, the source of the spice, and inextricably linked to the very air they breathed. This duality would have placed the worm at the center of their mythology. It would be both demon and god, the destroyer and the creator. Offerings might have been left for it not of food, which was scarce, but perhaps of sound. A thumper, a device designed to create a rhythmic pulse, would be a tool of sacrifice, used to deliberately call a worm to a specific location, perhaps to divert it from a settlement or as part of a rite of passage for a young warrior. To face the worm and survive was to prove one's mastery of the desert's ways. These are plausible functional rituals, born from the unique pressures of Arrakis. The people who practice them are gone, their names forgotten. But the logic of their actions, the deep wisdom encoded in their rituals, may not have vanished entirely. Such powerful ideas have a way of seeping into the cultural groundwater. When the next wave of settlers, the Zen-Sunni, arrived with their own rich spiritual traditions, they would have found themselves facing the same environmental pressures. And as they adapted, they may have independently rediscovered these same patterns of survival, these same desert rituals. The rhymes of history are loud on Arrakis, and the practices of these forgotten proto-tribes may have been the first verse in a song that the Fremen would one day sing. Chapter 14. The Silence Between Storms. An examination of a planet's history must include not just its dramatic transformations, but also its long periods of quietude, the immense, silent eras where the world is simply in a state of equilibrium. On Arrakis, these silences are profound. They are the true measure of the planet's character. This is a contemplation on the nature of time and patience on a world that operates on a scale beyond human reckoning. A single, vast dune in the deep desert, far from any rock or human settlement, may remain almost unchanged for 100 years, its shape maintained by a stable pattern of winds. A century, a span of time that can see human empires rise and fall, is but a moment of stillness for this dune. Its seasons are not measured in months, but in the slow, cyclical shifting of global weather patterns over thousands of years. Its life is a slow, deep breath. The creatures of this world exist in this sense of deep time. A sandworm may live for millennia. Its youth could be spent in a region of the desert that, by its old age, has been completely reshaped by a shift in the planet's climate. The worm migrates not like an animal across a landscape, but like a continent itself, a slow, inexorable force of nature, following the ancient, invisible pathways of spice and sand. Its consciousness, if it can be called that, would be one of immense, dreamlike patience. The frantic, fleeting lifespan of a human would be beneath its notice, a flicker of motion as brief and insignificant as a dust devil. Time on Arrakis is not linear, a straight arrow pointing from past to future. It is cyclical, recursive, like the endless turning of the spice cycle. The death of a worm leads to the birth of the sandtrout. The sandtrout's life leads to the spice blow. The spice leads to the nourishment of the worm. It is a closed loop, a circle with no true beginning or end. This rhythm is embedded in the very fabric of the planet. To live there for any length of time is to feel this cyclical nature, to understand that all things return, that endings are also beginnings. This sense of time breeds a unique form of cultural strength. In a galaxy driven by frantic expansion, by the constant pursuit of the new, Arrakis offers a profound and radical stillness. It teaches that some things cannot be rushed. The creation of spice is a process of aging. The growth of a worm is a matter of centuries. The erosion of a mountain is the work of eons. To try and force the pace of these processes is not just futile. It is a form of madness. It is to declare war on time itself, a war that no one can win. Consider the silence between the Coriolis storms. A storm may last for a month, a period of deafening, terrifying chaos where the world is a blur of sand and wind. And then, one day, the wind ceases. An absolute crystalline silence descends. The air is clear and cool. The twin moons cast sharp black shadows on the newly sculpted dunes. In this perfect stillness, the universe seems to hold its breath. It is a sacred, contemplative quiet. It is in these moments that the true scale of the world can be felt. One can feel the slow turning of the planet beneath one's feet, the immense silent presence of the stars above, and the patient, waiting life deep in the sand below. This is the comfort of accepting that some mysteries will remain buried. The precise history of the first inhabitants, the exact nature of the pre-sandtrout biosphere, these are questions that the desert may never answer. In the deep silence, one learns that this is acceptable. The universe is not obliged to reveal all of its secrets. To live with mystery, to embrace the unknown, is a form of wisdom that the desert teaches better than any philosophy. The people who are destined to master this world, the Fremen, will absorb this lesson into their very souls. Their concept of time will be different from that of the off-worlders. They will think in terms of generations, not fiscal quarters. They will have a patience that their imperial masters will mistake for sloth or stupidity. But it is a strength, a strategic advantage born from a deep harmony with their environment. The Fremen will learn to wait. They will wait for the right moment to strike, for the right season to plant, for the prophecy to come to fruition. They will have learned their sense of time from the dunes, and from the worms, and from the long, patient silence between the storms. A study of Arrakis is incomplete without acknowledging these quiet periods. The events of history are the storms, but the meaning is found in the calm that follows. Chapter 15. Lessons written in dust. Every world teaches a lesson. A lush garden world might teach of harmony and abundance. A harsh, ice-bound world might teach of endurance and community. Arrakis, in its stark and uncompromising beauty, teaches a set of lessons that are perhaps the most profound and necessary of all. They are lessons in humility, in adaptation, and in the true meaning of power. This is an ethical reflection, a consideration of the wisdom that is written in the dust of the desert planet. The first and most fundamental lesson of Arrakis is the failure of the conquest narrative. From their first encounters with the planet, outsiders, be they prospectors, corporations, or imperial powers, approached it with the mindset of dominion. They came to tame, to control, to exploit. They brought their powerful machines, their advanced science, their unshakable belief in their own superiority. And they failed. Their machines were swallowed by the sand. Their terraforming dreams turned into nightmares. Their attempts to impose their will on the planet's ecosystem were met with violent and catastrophic resistance. Arrakis could not be conquered. It could not be forced to yield its treasures. The planet itself was an active participant in its own defense, and its primary weapon was its own integrated, self-regulating nature. The narrative of conquest, of humanity as the master of its environment, shattered against the reality of the desert. In its place, Arrakis demanded a narrative of stewardship. The spice, the most valuable substance in the universe, was not a resource to be plundered, but a gift of a complex and fragile ecosystem. To ensure the continued flow of that gift, the givers, the worms, the sandtrout, the desert itself had to be understood and respected. The goal could not be to destroy the worms to get the spice, for the worms and the spice were one. The goal had to be to coexist with the worms, to learn their ways, and to harvest the spice in a way that did not disrupt the fundamental cycle. This is a profound shift in perspective. It moves from a relationship of dominance to one of reverence. It replaces arrogance with humility. The true power on Arrakis did not belong to the one with the biggest army or the most advanced technology. It belonged to the one with the deepest understanding, the most intimate knowledge of the desert's ways. Power was not about force, it was about attunement. This leads to the second great lesson, the wisdom of adaptation. On Arrakis, the environment is the ultimate authority. Its laws, the need for water, the danger of rhythm, the fury of the storms are absolute and non-negotiable. To survive, one cannot change the laws. One must change oneself. This principle is embodied in the technologies and practices that succeed on the planet. The stillsuit is a perfect example. It does not try to create water where there is none. Instead, it accepts the scarcity of water as a fundamental reality and adapts the human body to it. turning it into a closed-loop system of reclamation and recycling. The sandwalk does not try to silence the desert so that one may walk freely. It adapts the human footstep to the desert's own chaotic sounds. The Fremen siege does not try to dominate the landscape with towering fortresses. It adapts human settlement to the existing landscape, finding shelter within the planet's own rock formations. This is a lesson that extends beyond mere survival. It is a philosophy of life. It suggests that wisdom lies not in bending the world to our will, but in bending ourselves to the world's realities. It champions flexibility over rigidity, subtlety over brute force, and observation over assumption. Arrakis teaches that the most successful organism is not the strongest, but the one most willing to change. Finally, Arrakis teaches a lesson about the nature of wealth. The spice melange was the source of immense galactic wealth. It propped up the imperial throne, funded the great houses, and made interstellar travel possible. But the planet itself, the source of this wealth, was a place of profound poverty in conventional terms. It had no soil, no easily accessible water, no material comforts. This paradox reveals a deep truth. The off-worlders who controlled the spice trade were rich in coin, but they were poor in understanding. They lived in constant fear of the desert, trapped in their fortified cities. The people of the desert, the future Fremen, would have no currency, no material possessions beyond what they could carry, but they would be rich in a different way. They would be rich in water, rich in knowledge, rich in community, and rich in freedom. They possessed the true wealth of Arrakis, which was the secret of how to live upon it. The lessons written in dust are not easy ones. They challenge the most cherished assumptions about progress, power, and humanity's place in the universe. But they are essential. Arrakis is a mirror, reflecting back the flaws in human ambition. It is a teacher, patient, and severe. It demonstrates that true mastery is not about control, but about respect. True strength is not in imposition, but in adaptation. And true wealth is not in what one can take from a world, but in what one can learn from it. These are the truths that the desert imparts to those who are humble enough to listen. Chapter 16. Toward the Threshold of Fremen History. The journey through the deep past of Arrakis is drawing to a close. Its fiery birth has been witnessed, its age of oceans explored, its slow transformation into a desert world chronicled, the emergence of its strange and wonderful life, and the first tentative footfalls of humanity upon its surface have been examined. The stage is now set. The ecosystem is mature, the rules of survival are established, and the great secret of the spice has been revealed to the galaxy. We now stand on the threshold of known history, preparing the ground for the arrival of the people who will not just visit Arrakis, but make it their own, the Fremen. To understand their arrival, one must first look away from Arrakis, to the sprawling, ancient history of human migration across the stars. For thousands of years, waves of settlement had spread humanity to countless worlds. In this great diaspora, spiritual and philosophical traditions evolved and diverged. One of the most resilient and enduring of these was the Zen Sunni school of thought, a syncretic faith that blended elements of many ancient religions, emphasizing self-reliance, spiritual discipline, and a deep, mystical connection to the universe. The Zen Sunni were wanderers, often persecuted for their beliefs, which were seen as fatalistic and insular by the mainstream imperial culture. They moved from world to world, seeking a place where they could practice their faith in peace, a sanctuary that would test and purify their souls. They carried with them a collection of sacred texts and oral traditions, and a powerful messianic prophecy of a paradise world, a Sharia, that they would one day find and make their own. It is a matter of historical record, not speculation, that the ancestors of the Fremen were Zen Sunni wanderers. For generations, they were enslaved and transported from planet to planet, their beliefs hardening in the crucible of oppression. Their journey was a long and painful one, but it was also a period of intense cultural and spiritual preparation. They became masters of survival in harsh environments, their faith teaching them a patience and a communal strength that their oppressors could not break. Sometime before the establishment of the Corino Empire as we know it, a group of these Zen Sunni slaves were transported to the planet Poritrin. There, They were forced to work as laborers on a complex botanical research project. It was here that they encountered a brilliant and sympathetic planetologist, a man whose name is remembered in legend, Kynes. He was fascinated by their deep faith and their incredible resilience. He saw in them the human qualities necessary to survive, and even thrive, in the most extreme environments. Through a complex series of events, these Zen-Sunni wanderers, guided and aided by figures like Kynes, eventually found their way to Arrakis, the Imperium. Seeing the planet as a useful and remote dumping ground for troublesome populations may have even facilitated this migration, not understanding the profound destiny they were setting in motion. When the Zen-Sunni first arrived on Arrakis, they did not see a wasteland. They saw the fulfillment of a prophecy. The harshness of the desert was not a deterrent. It was a test, the ultimate crucible for their faith. The great worms were not monsters. They were the physical manifestation of the divine power of the universe. The spice was not a drug. It was a sacred substance, a key to a deeper spiritual reality. They had come home. They did not arrive empty-handed. They brought with them the accumulated wisdom of their long journey, a deep understanding of community, a tradition of ecological thinking, and a fierce, unshakable will to survive. They found a world that seemed perfectly, almost purposefully, designed to reward their particular virtues. Their faith taught patience. The desert demanded it. Their culture prized water. The desert made it sacred. Their prophecies spoke of a paradise to be earned. The desert offered the challenge. They were not the first humans to walk on Arrakis, but they were the first to come with the intention of staying forever. They were the first to look at the desert and see not an enemy, but a teacher. They brought with them the seeds of a culture, the language, the religion, the social structures, and planted them in the harsh but fertile ground of the desert. The history of the Fremen, their long struggle, their adaptation, their eventual mastery of the planet is a story for another time. The purpose here has been to prepare the ground, to show how the planet itself was shaped, over billions of years, into the unique environment that the Zen-Sunni wanderers would find. The faint caravan routes that were beginning to be etched between the rock settlements, the dry riverbeds used as sheltered pathways, the deep ecological literacy that was being pieced together by the first imperial planetologists. All these were the threads that the Fremen would pick up and weave into the rich tapestry of their own culture. They were the inheritors of all the history we have discussed, the final, crucial element that would complete the Arrakeen ecosystem. They were the human expression of the desert's own fierce spirit. The threshold has been reached. The people have arrived. The untold history is about to become the told. Chapter 17. Echoes that travel forward. As this chronicle of the deep past concludes, it is useful to gather its thematic threads and see how they weave into the future. The history of a world is not just a sequence of events. It is a collection of powerful ideas, of resonant motifs that echo forward through time. The Arrakis that the Fremen would inherit was not just a physical landscape, but a landscape of meaning, shaped by the fundamental truths that had emerged over its long evolution. These were the echoes, waiting in the silence for a people who could hear them. The first and most powerful echo was the sacredness of water. This idea was born in the Great Drying, in the slow, agonizing disappearance of the planet's oceans. For any life that survived, water became the central defining value, the measure of all things. The sandtrout embodied this principle, dedicating their entire existence to finding and sequestering it. This deep biological imperative, this planetary thirst, created a psychic resonance. When the Fremen arrived, their own cultural reverence for water, born from their travels through other dry worlds, found its ultimate expression. The Fremen ritual of reclaiming water from the dead was not an invention. It was a discovery, a human articulation of the planet's oldest and most ruthless law. The planet itself had been practicing it for 1 billion years. The second echo was the duality of rhythm. This lesson was taught by the worms. Rhythm meant life, the steady beat of a heart, the cyclical nature of the seasons on other worlds. But on Arrakis, rhythm meant death. It was a summons to the desert's guardian, an invitation to destruction. This inversion of a universal principle created a profound tension. To survive, humanity had to unlearn one of its most basic instincts. This forced a state of constant, heightened awareness, a deep listening to the world. The Fremen culture of silence, of the sandwalk, of listening to the sand, was the human answer to this ancient echo. They learned that safety lay in chaos, in unpredictability, in blending one's own life rhythm into the greater, non-rhythmic pulse of the desert. The third echo was the idea of patience as a form of strength. This was the lesson of geological time. The mountains did not resist the wind with force. They yielded to it over millennia. And in that yielding, their dust created the dunes, a new and powerful landscape. The spice did not achieve its potency overnight. It aged in the sun, slowly maturing into its final form. The worms did not hunt with speed. They moved with a slow, inexorable certainty. The planet itself was an object lesson in the power of slow, patient processes. The Fremen absorbed this echo into their strategic thinking. Their jihad would not be a single, explosive event, but a slow, patient, multi-generational struggle. They understood that true, lasting change is not accomplished in a day, but over the long, patient arc of time. Their patience was their most powerful weapon, a gift from the planet itself. The fourth echo was the desert as a purifier. This motif began with the planet's fiery birth, a sterilization by cosmic heat. It continued in the Great Drying, which scoured the world of its easy, abundant, aquatic life, selecting only for the most resilient. The Coriolis storms continued this process, wiping the slate clean, testing every structure and every life form. Arrakis was a crucible, a place that burned away all that was unnecessary, all that was weak or superfluous. The Zensuni wanderers arrived with a theology that was already centered on this very idea that suffering and hardship were the path to spiritual purity. They found on Arrakis a physical embodiment of their faith. The desert was not just their home, it was their temple, their monastery, the ultimate testing ground for the strength of their souls. These echoes of water as life, of rhythm as danger, of patience as strength, and of the desert as a purifier were the spiritual and psychological inheritance of Arrakis. They were not written in any book, but they were present in the wind, in the sand, in the life cycle of the worms. They were the planet's soul. The Fremen did not impose their culture on the desert. They listened to these ancient echoes and built a culture that was in perfect harmony with them. They gave human names and human stories to the deep, timeless truths that had governed the world since its beginning. The planet had been whispering its laws for eons, and in the Fremen, it finally found a people who were willing to listen. Chapter 18, The Desert That Chose Itself. This journey ends where it began, with the planet itself. We have traveled from the heart of a stellar nebula to the surface of a mature and complex world. We have seen Arrakis as a ball of fire, as a world of water, and finally, as the great, cinnamon-dusted desert that would change the course of human history. And if there is a single, unifying idea to be taken from this immense chronicle, it is this. Arrakis is not a wasteland. It is not a mistake. It is not a world that failed to become a garden. Arrakis is a world that chose its own destiny. It was not a conscious choice, not the decision of a thinking mind. It was a choice made by physics, by chemistry, by geology, and finally, by biology. It was an emergent property, the result of a billion years of feedback loops and evolutionary pressures. But it was a choice nonetheless. The planet, through the agency of its own life forms, actively and violently defends its arid state. It has created a perfect self-sustaining system whose primary function is to maintain itself as a desert. This is a radical and humbling idea. It challenges the human-centric view that a planet's value is measured by its ability to support us. Arrakis does not exist for us, it exists for itself. Its ecosystem, from the smallest sandtrout to the largest worm, is a testament to the power of a world to create and preserve its own unique identity. The desert is not an absence of life. It is a design, patient, precise, and utterly alien to our own expectations. The story began by peeling back the names Dune, Arrakis, to find the planet beneath. Now, at the end, the planet itself has earned a name, a title that is more than a label. It is a description of its character, the world that made itself a desert, the world that learned to thrive on scarcity. The world that turned its greatest weakness, its lack of water, into its greatest strength. The engine of the spice cycle. The arrival of humanity was, from the planet's perspective, simply the latest in a long series of environmental factors. And like any other factor, humanity was either incorporated into the system or it was rejected. The conquerors, with their rhythmic machines and their dreams of rain, were rejected. Their methods were incompatible with the planet's fundamental nature. They were an invasive species, and the planet's immune system, the worms, eradicated them. The Fremen, however, were incorporated. They adapted. They learned to walk without rhythm, to conserve water, to respect the power of the worm. They became a part of the desert's ecosystem, another keystone species, as integral to its function as the sand and the spice. They did not conquer the desert. They joined it. They were the desert's human expression. And so, this history ends where the popular histories begin. We leave Arrakis on the cusp of its most famous era, but with a new and deeper understanding of the forces that will shape it. The struggles for control of the spice, the rise of the Atreides, the Jihad of Muad'Dib, all of these epic events will play out on the stage that we have spent our time exploring. And they will all be governed by the ancient laws that were laid down long before any human set foot on the sand. The desert that chose itself is a place of profound and patient power. It does not yield its secrets easily. But for those who are willing to listen, to learn, and to adapt, it offers wisdom unlike any other. It is a reminder that the universe is full of wonders that do not conform to our expectations, and that the most beautiful designs are often the most severe. The great, silent, sandy beast of a planet is now fully awake. It has its guardians, its treasure, and its people. The story of deep time is over. The human story is about to begin. Epilogue: The Dune remembers. Under the light of its twin moons, the planet Arrakis rests. The stars, unobscured by moisture or pollution, form a brilliant, silent tapestry. The air is cold and clean, carrying the faint, eternal scent of cinnamon. On the horizon, the endless sea of sand is still. The only movement is the slow, patient breath of the wind, whispering from one dune to the next. The desert remembers. It remembers the fire of its birth, in the lines of the ancient basalt. It remembers the taste of its long-lost oceans in the salt of the great pans. It remembers the first desperate life that learned to hoard water and dream of spice. It remembers the colossi that grew from that desperation, the great worms that now rest beneath the sand. Their existence, a slow, deep rhythm of the planet's heart. The desert is not empty. It is full of time. It is full of memory. And it is full of a quiet, waiting potential. A people have come who understand its ways. A treasure has been revealed that will draw the eyes of an empire. A future is about to be born from the deep and ancient past. The silence holds all of history and all of prophecy in its cool embrace. It is a silence pregnant with the future. A future that will be built on the stillness, the vastness, and the patient, waiting sand. The dune remembers. And it waits.